The release of the Epstein Files could go down as one of the most important troves of data in history. Not just because they exposed the twisted and depraved pedophile parties that the world's most notorious sex trafficker held on his private Caribbean island, but because they paint a complete and intimate picture of how the richest and most powerful people communicate and socialize when they don't think that anyone is watching. In this episode, I'm going to talk about just a very small corner of the Epstein Files, which I think can serve as a microcosm for the entire archive. It's about the relationship between the wellness influencer and internet famous doctor Peter Attia and Jeffrey Epstein. I'm focusing on Attia in part because he's been on this channel before in a video I did about how a lawsuit he filed against the medical device tracker Oura Ring exposed the way that wellness and pharma companies buy influence over people and science itself. But now, with a periscope into their personal communications, you can see a similar pattern playing out between the incredibly wealthy and well-connected Epstein and just a budding medical influencer who would soon come to dominate the podcast circuit and found one of the most lucrative concierge medical practices in history. Attia entered Epstein's orbit around 2014 while he was raising money for the $40 million Nutrition Sciences Initiative, likely at first to solicit Epstein for potential donations. Once he has a beachhead in that relationship, Attia begins to ask for more contacts with other rich people that access Epstein's network, from Bill Gates and Sean Parker, and even the Pope. But then, in September 2015, he pitches Epstein on this new idea of becoming his personal doctor. And this begins his transition away from medical research. And in December, he tells Epstein that he's onto a much more lucrative world of concierge medicine. Because of Epstein's access to the very richest and most powerful people in the world, Attia is able to gather private clients who can afford to spend between $100 and, believe this or not, $300,000 a year just to consult with him. While his roster of clients is not public, his invitation to Jeff Bezos' wedding, as well as Bezos' likely testosterone-fueled massive muscle gain, for which Attia is a prominent proponent, indicate that his clients are the richest and most powerful people in the world. As of 2026, Attia says that he has 75 private patients, which we can assume brings him between $20 and $40 million a year. And yet, for all the success and all of his riches, Attia is still small potatoes in relation to the sultans and heads of state and billionaires and oligarchs who appear all over the Epstein Files. Epstein and Attia exchanged roughly 600 emails in just 3 years. Their messages start more formally, but it's apparent that they were friends, with Attia clearly trying to impress and flatter Epstein at every chance he gets. Eventually, Attia writes to Epstein's assistant that he goes into, quote, JE withdrawal when I don't see him after a meeting gets canceled. He also begins mirroring the language that would be familiar to anyone reading the other emails in Epstein's trove. Highlights include a response to what I think was a phone call in 2016 where Attia writes, "Pussy is indeed low carb. Still awaiting results on gluten content, though." And then, sycophantically, just a little while later, "The life you lead is so outrageous, and yet I can't tell a soul," after Epstein sent him what is now a redacted photo of him with young women, which we should assume were somehow involved in Epstein's sex trafficking operation. Now, I want to pause here and zoom out to the bigger picture, because these types of exchanges turn out to be pretty normal in Epstein's emails, from his sexting for pussy with a redacted correspondent to the litany of lewd notes in the so-called birthday book. The thing that drew so many wealthy people to Epstein, I believe, wasn't the sex parties themselves, but the fact that the outrageous activities on his private island were so unbelievably exclusive that they were actually a path to power. Epstein was at the epicenter of politics and finance and philanthropy and sex trafficking. His main value, from what I can tell, was his ability to facilitate access and introductions between power brokers across the world who shared his dark secret. To name just a few, and you've heard these before, we've got Prince Andrew and Bill Gates and Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Trump and Clinton, to the ex-Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the Google founder Sergey Brin, and Steve Bannon. All show up in the correspondence with similar reputation-smelting exchanges. Getting a connection to Epstein was a way to share an exclusive secret that should absolutely never be public. But the people who share that secret, well, they earn each other's trust implicitly. It's the same reason that criminal gangs sometimes require people to commit a crime, maybe murder or arson or whatever else, before letting in a new member. Anyone who attended Epstein's parties was implicated in the sort of moral flexibility that facilitates business transactions. It's not so different from that famous photo of RFK sharing a McDonald's meal with Trump and Elon Musk right after Trump's win, despite RFK spending decades railing against exactly those sorts of processed foods. RFK's moral flexibility turned out to be an asset that Trump could use. And like Trump, this was Epstein's magic, a sort of exclusive perk that money alone cannot buy. The elites around Epstein often had their own aircraft, their yachts, apartments, dream vacations, and pretty much whatever their hearts desired. Everyone in the world kowtows to the billionaire class, which conversely makes billionaires ever more lustful for things that they can't access. And maybe it's a fundamentally human trait to always overvalue exclusivity, which incidentally is exactly what Attia sells in his medical practice. While Attia dishes out free medical advice on his podcast, his mega best-selling book Outlive, his YouTube channel, and his blog, his real money comes from product sponsorships and his private client service. Epstein funneled opportunities Attia's way, and the lewd language was a social lubricant that proved that Attia was essentially a made man, a perfect sycophant to power. Once all of these personal communications came to light, however, a few weeks ago, Attia switched into damage control, and his responses on X mirror exactly what I've been saying in this video so far. Let me quote you his recent rather long tweet. At that point in my career, I had little exposure to prominent people, and that level of access was novel to me. Everything about him seemed excessive and exclusive, including the fact that he lived in the largest home in all of Manhattan, owned a Boeing 727, and hosted parties with the most powerful and prominent leaders in business and politics. I treated that access as something to be quiet about rather than discussed freely with others. One line in that exchange of these emails about his life being outrageous and me not being able to tell anyone is being interpreted as awareness of his wrongdoing. That is not how I meant it at all. What I was referring to, poorly and flippantly, was the discretion commanded by those social and professional circles. The idea that you don't talk to anyone about who you meet at those dinner parties you attend and the power and influence of the people in those settings. What I wrote in that email reads terribly, and I own that. And it's quite an apology, and it's worded really well, I would guess. But the fact is that at that point that he was writing that, Epstein had already been convicted of sex crimes. Being in Epstein's orbit was being in a private club where power, money, and access and sex, they all intermingled. And the 3 million documents that have just been released show how this nexus of criminality and power connects an enormous chunk of the global elite to this one specific person and the places he inhabited. Which is to say that the real story isn't just about the way that Epstein abused women, as terrible as those stories have been, and they are terrible, but how power brokers all seem to agree that at least being okay with abusing women was the price of admission. Now, global elites will argue that they didn't know the extent of what Epstein was doing in private. They all universally state that whatever sexcapades got up to on his own was entirely separate from their interactions with the man. It's almost like he trafficked thousands of women only to himself. Of course, I think in some cases that was probably true. Just attending a state dinner with Epstein doesn't necessarily imply that you took part in an orgy. But what is interesting, at least in Attia's case, is that their relationship started largely after Epstein was first convicted of sex trafficking. And even with that stain on his record, the emails prove that elites still circled him for access. In fact, they seem to admire him even more for appearing to get away with it. One thing that I feel that I need to say about Attia is also perhaps the most damning of all. In Attia's New York Times bestselling book on longevity called Outlive, Attia writes about his own mental health struggles. He begins one of the later chapters in the book explaining how he tried to start a fist fight with a man in a parking lot, writing, "I was standing right in his face, begging him to throw the first punch so I could rip his larynx out, a procedure I described in surgical detail with a few choice epithets to boot. I'm pretty certain that I would have won the fight, but I also could have lost everything: my house, my medical license, my freedom, probably what was left of my marriage. Outwardly, I was a successful seeming guy with a thriving medical practice, a beautiful wife and kids, wonderful friends, robust health, and a contract to write this book. But in reality, I was out of control." Now, I do find it just a little bit funny that even while explaining how self-destructive his rage could get, he also makes a point of telling the reader that he would have definitely won the fight had they come to blows. It's the sort of detail that shows the state of his fragile ego and his desire for the reader to acknowledge his alpha manliness. Anyway, the important part of the chapter comes in actually the next paragraph, where he notes that, quote, "On Tuesday, July 11th, 2017, at 5:45 p.m. to be exact, that his wife called him saying that their infant son was lifeless and blue and that they were on the way to the hospital. The nurse revived the child with CPR, but they weren't sure if he was going to make it. His wife wanted Attia to come home, but Attia was in New York at the time and he was too busy with, quote, important meetings. He leaves her to care for her child alone for 11 days. Now, Attia uses this story as leverage to explain how much personal growth he still has to do, how addiction is a disease, and I guess his addiction was being an asshole. But the Epstein releases put an entirely different sheen on what was really going on. As the doctor and prominent Attia critic Jennifer Gunter notes in her examination of the Epstein Files, that same day, just 3 hours before he got the call from his wife, Attia writes to Epstein asking about an in-person meeting. They're having some scheduling conflicts, and they settle on a time to meet on July 13th, which is 2 days after his child has landed in the hospital, and he attends that meeting. So imagine, if you will, what this tells us about Attia's priorities. He would rather wait around in New York for 3 whole days while his 1-month-old son is dying so that he could meet one of the world's most notorious sex traffickers. This all happens at the same time. Well, I don't think that the 2-hour appointment was long enough for Attia to attend any sort of massage or sex party. Epstein was clearly on a plane out of town just 5 hours after their meeting. This exchange clearly demonstrates how the lure of power and money outperforms any ethical impulses that someone has to be a good person and do the morally right thing in any particular situation. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning. How the Epstein Files are a microcosm of the morality of the global elite. The people who run this world are all connected in a tight web of economic, social, and business relationships. Those relationships define who they are more than any ideology that they pretend to espouse. While Epstein notably gave to democratic causes, had Bill Clinton over frequently as a guest, he also had decades-long friendships with Trump and Steve Bannon. And this is the reality that we all need to see clearly. At the top levels of elite life, the distinctions that we think exist in the world between the right and the left, the technocrats and the Luddites, all break down. They're all buddies. At the end of the day, the rich and powerful are actually defined by who they are in private, not the public personas that appear in the media that they, frankly, largely own. The elite don't have politics as we think of them. They only have allegiances to power. The real miracle of the Epstein Files is that their private communications break down that image. They prove that the only real distinction that we need to keep our eye on is between the global elites who run the show and the people like you and me who have let them do that so far and given them that power. The Epstein Files are our opportunity to see reality for what it actually is, because none of these files, Epstein or any of those powerful people, wanted to be public. And with that, I have one more thing to say, and think of it as a homework assignment. The most recent release of files contained more than 3 million documents, including just about every email that Epstein sent or received over the course of a decade. Obviously, I've only read a tiny fraction of them. That's partly because if you go to the DOJ website, the files are only organized through a search function, which makes trying to understand what is in them pretty hard, because if you don't know what is in there, you can't search for it. I mean, there's no way to simply scroll through emails to find out what's going on chronologically and then go to the next email to see how people reply. It's almost as if the DOJ is trying to make it hard for citizens to go through. However, independent developers at a website called jmail.world were able to download the entire archive and organize it into an interface that will be familiar to anyone who uses Gmail. And when you're done watching this video, I want you to go take a look at it yourself. And there's a link down in the description, down below my head right now. And there are thousands of worthwhile stories hidden in these files. But the most important story of all is simply that you can read their words for yourself. So go do it. And then tell me the spiciest things you find down in the comments, because I really want to know what you find. Thanks so much for watching this examination of Epstein and Attia. If you want to support this channel and the sort of independent journalism that I do here, I would love you to subscribe to my free Substack newsletter. It's at sgcarney.substack.com. And if you're like a patron of the arts, you can become a premium subscriber where you'll get early access to my work and here on YouTube, but also get that warm and fuzzy feeling that you're a small part of what keeps this kind of journalism online. From Foxtopus Inc. in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates. Thank you so much to my supporters here on Patreon and on Substack and even on YouTube who make this work possible. It means the world to me that you're here. And if you want to get your name on the honor roll, all you need to do is sign up at the links down below. From Foxtopus Inc. in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates.